Hello, everyone. Good morning to those in APAC time zone, including Audrey, and then good evening to others who are joining from the US East Coast. I am so thrilled that we've got the pleasure of interviewing and speaking and learning from Audrey Tang, who has an incredible background. So today we are going to talk through some of Audrey's challenges, the life that she's had, and the incredible lessons that she's learned, and what she thinks about the future of AI and democracy. And then at the end, hopefully, Audrey, you'll be able to take some questions from the audience. And as you know, International Intrigue is a very engaged community of folks who are interested in the world and our future in it. So I'm sure they'll have lots of questions for you. So to kick it off, I would love to be able to share some really fantastic facts that I know about Audrey. I mean, we first met, I first saw you when you were giving a talk to Google, I think when I still worked at Google, about sort of awful but lawful content that's on the internet. And I thought,
hmm
oh, this is obviously awful, so we need to do something about it. And then we met in 2022 again when we talked about, or 2023, about AI and democracy and what that was looking like for China, for the US. And then since then, it seems like so many other things have changed. So with all that, I want to be able to give that grounding for folks of how, I was able to meet Audrey and share some fun facts. Audrey, hope you don't mind. According to the internet, you are the same age as the internet. So you were born in 19, I think 83, 80, when the internet was born.
81 was
81, there you
personal
go. My
computers.
mistake.
Internet was earlier, but personal computers was that age.
There you go. Okay. So according to the internet, you guys are the same age. And then I think your first language was not Hokkien, Mandarin, or Chinese, but it was JavaScript, correct?
That's a urban legend.
That's an urban legend. Okay, one that
I
we're
started learning programming when I was 8, but yes, that's still quite early during that time, the 80s.
incredible. Well, and the last thing is something that actually Intrigue very much shares, which is your idea of humor over rumor, right? When you're dealing with misinformation. But with that, I do want to go into your formal biography because I think it's incredible for folks to understand. So Audrey Tang, who we have here, is a Time 100 Most Influential People in AI honoree in 2023, and served, well, it's currently Taiwan's cyber ambassador and served as Taiwan's first digital minister and the world's first non-binary cabinet minister from 2016 to 2024. So this is recently you just shifted into this new role. And as a child, I know, Audrey, you had practiced Taoism to moderate all strong emotions and survive a cardiac condition. And after attending 10 educational institutions in 10 years, she left formal schooling to pursue self-education at age 14, which is incredible. I don't even know how I was functioning at age 14. In her 20s, Tang rose to prominence as a leader in free and open source software, revitalizing the Haskell and Perl programming languages. And then during her 30s, Tang played a crucial role in shaping Gov Zero. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it right. One of the most prominent civic tech movements worldwide. And in 2014, she helped broadcast the demands of the Sunflower Movement activists and worked to resolve conflicts during a 3-week occupation of Taiwan's legislature. And you also became a reverse mentor to the minister in charge of digital participation before holding the role yourself in 2016. Um, Audrey had helped develop participatory democracy platforms such as Taiwan and Join to bring civic innovation into the public sector through initiatives like the Presidential Hackathon and Ideathon, all sorts of thons. And other accomplishments for Tang include shaping Taiwan's internationally acclaimed COVID-19 response, which I remember, as well as safeguarding the country's 2024 presidential and legislative elections from cyber interference. Now, none of this even mentions your book Plurality, which I would, hope to get into later on. But with that, Audrey, I would love to sort of hear a little bit more about how you chose to get into politics. As a lot of the things that we've mentioned, you saw the internet as a really wonderful domain when you were growing up, and then slowly you sort of saw that change and the relationship that humans have with the internet change. So tell us how you sort of got to where you are today.
Yeah, certainly. Really happy to be on this webinar. I often say that my personal journey mirrors Taiwan's own transition to democracy. I was born,
Hmm.
as you noted, in 81, when Taiwan was still under martial law. And my family, my parents were both journalists and community organizers. By the time I was 6, Taiwan was beginning to democratize. And around the same time, I fell in love with computers. I had a congenital heart condition that kept me out of school a lot, but that just meant that I spent much more time learning on my own. And so, not just coding without a personal computer at first, I started pretending to type on the paper keyboard that I drew,
Mm.
imagining the output until my parents got me a real computer. And that set me on an unusual path. So I dropped out of middle school when I was 15 and started a small software business. So at the time,
Wow.
I wasn't political to be dedicating my full-time job to politics, but it's in the ambience because our first presidential election was in 96, and that's already after the browser, the World Wide Web, and so on. So naturally, people imagine democracy instead of a hundred years long tradition, something more like semiconductor, that every 9 months you see a new iteration and you can improve the bandwidth of democracy. And my dad served as spokesperson to one of the presidential candidates on the first direct presidential election. He didn't win, but that got me a lot of early exposure into this nascent form of democracy. And so I guess my first foray for real into politics was when I was 33, when I already kind of retired from the private tech sector after being an entrepreneur for almost 2 decades now, but by the time of 2014. And at the time, the Taiwanese government, Ma Ying-jeou, the president, was enjoying an approval rate of 9%, not very high. And people, 500,000, went on the street and actually peacefully occupied the parliament for 3 weeks to demonstrate against what's called the CSSTA, the Cross-Strait Service and Trade Act, which would have opened up our telecoms, our publishing to the Xi Jinping thought of the day, of the Beijing regime, through a trade deal. And so we kind of not just protested, but just demonstrated by showing that actually you can get 500,000 people discussing in conversation networks and citizen assemblies what ought to be getting in before we signing a service trade agreement with Beijing. And amazingly, after 3 weeks of peaceful conversation, the Speaker of the Parliament, Wang Jinping at the time, basically said, the people's version are better than our parliamentary version, so let's go with their version. So the Occupy was not just a success, but we, the civic activists, were then tapped as reverse mentors into the cabinet. So that was my first like real foray into politics by supporting the live streaming, supporting the conversation networks, the organization, and building situational applications for the Sunflower Movement.
That's incredible. I mean, it sounds like very early stage of participatory democracy as well, right? And sort of involving, I think, stakeholder engagement, but in a much more broadcasted capacity. I want to dive into your time as Taiwan's digital minister. I think at the time when you had that role, it was one of the few countries that actually had an active digital minister as opposed to somebody in the role who was sort of nominally doing, tech related stuff. But what exactly it looked like, what did your day look like as a Taiwan digital minister? And what are some of the huge challenges that you faced? I know there was a barrage of information, misinformation, disinformation, that Taiwan really was at the front line of a lot of the campaign coming out of the CCP and other bot farms elsewhere. But can you talk us through what that experience was like, and have you recovered from that experience now, and or are you still traumatized from that time?
Well, yes, as the national tech support since
Exactly.
2016. Yeah, I think one thing going in was to look at approval rate of 9% a decade ago and figure out a way to earn back the trust from citizens. And as a Taoist, my favorite saying from Tao Te Ching, from Lao Tzu, is, and I quote, to give no trust is to get no trust. End of quote. And what that means is that instead of expecting citizens to trust the government, we expect citizens to be skeptical, but the government should trust the citizens. And to express that trust, we instilled what's called radical transparency, essentially to open up the decision-making process and invite people in. And so, what the first challenge, obviously, is to convince a traditionally hierarchical government about opening up data continuously and conversations around those policy making. So if you go to sayit.archive.tw now, you will actually say that since I became the digital minister in 2016, I've talked with 8,000 people in more than 2,000 occasions with almost 400,000 segments of speech, and all of them are in public domain. So every
Please
lobbyist visit.
repeat that address again for people who are listening. Repeat
Sure.
the webpage.
Well, we have a working chat, so how about
Oh,
not
there you
using it?
go.
Say it, the
Thank you.
archive that you
Check
have.
at play.
Yeah. That's right.
Okay.
Yes. There. Yeah. Right. So the point of radical transparency is not about shaming any person or live streaming all the meetings or things like that. Actually, it's only me that remains in real name throughout all the transcripts. Now, people can be meronymic, meaning that you just know that, okay, there is a representative from this ministry that said this, and so on. So it's not about naming individual people, but it is about opening up the why and the how of policy making, not just what of the policies made. And we also made sure that the government data is not just broadcasted like air quality and things like that, but also broad listening as well. So people can set up their own measurements for air pollution, water pollution, noise levels, and so on, provide their own take on the budget details, and so on, so that we ensure that in real time we build this conduit of trust. This proved to be essential during the pandemic when people certainly have a lot to say about, as you mentioned, the contested information around mask availability, mask use, vaccine availability, vaccine use, and things like that. They really paid off when we proved that through this kind of distributed ledger where nothing could be hidden, people can monitor the mask availability using their phone, using an app developed by citizen scientists, actually more than 100 of such applications and so on, ensuring more than 70% of public approval of citizen
Wow.
trust in 2020.
I mean, that's unheard of here in the US. So I'm very, very impressed by that. And are you able to speak to a little bit more of the disinformation and the way that Taiwan had sort of approached or fought back against disinformation? Because I think for this audience who are primarily sort of focused in global affairs and interested in geopolitics, disinformation is not necessarily new, right? It's a sort of play out of the playbook of ancient times. But how has it been amplified in our daily, in our current age, and what was Taiwan's response to it?
Yeah, definitely. I think it really took a turn for the worse starting 2015, when Instagram and Facebook, soon to be it's the same property at the time, and then Twitter and pretty much everybody else, even YouTube, started to shift its algorithm from a shared kind of micro-blogging, everybody looking at the same feeds they subscribe, into what's called the For You feed, which really means a parasitic AI trained on this engagement through enragement, so that each and every one of us see a very different timeline, and our attention is then sold to the highest bidder. It could be authoritarian, propagandists, or it could be just normal scammers. But anyway, the point here is that people, far from a shared social fabric, started to see the strip mining of the social fabric in the service of what's called the antisocial corner of the social media that just kept growing larger after TikTok and things like that, where all attention hacked since 2015. And so instead of censoring information, which is a big no-no in Taiwan, because as I mentioned, we've had decades of martial law. So nobody wants to go back to the white terror, to censorship, and so on. Any attempt by the government to say, oh, let's moderate some online discussions is fundamentally unwinnable in our political climate. So we
Mm.
have to figure out how to fight back against authoritarian propaganda without becoming authoritarian ourselves. And so to do that, really the only way to work is to pre-bunk rather than debunk. Because in this adversarial anti-social media corner, debunking is always too little, too late. On the other hand, pre-bunk meaning naming these tactics and sharing with people what's called the uncommon ground. So one very quick example, early in the pandemic, 2020, there's one site that says only N95 masks, the highest grade, are useful. Every other mask is placebo. Another side of the people online said, oh, it's ventilation, it's aerosol, so any kind of mask would hurt you, and N95 hurts the most. And in early 2020, the science is really out there. There's not a lot of consensus, even among scientists, around the efficacy of masks against this new version of the virus. But instead of letting this polarization spiraling out of hand, we deployed this uncommon ground, which is a public service announcement very quickly, which is a very cute dog, a Shiba Inu, putting her paw to her mouth saying, wear a mask to remind each other to keep your dirty and washed hand from your face. And so it shifted what the mask means from something that could polarize into something that's very funny. So this is called humor over rumor. And we
Yes.
measured tap water usage. It really did increase once people laughed about this common thing. And it de-escalated the situation. Because if you don't wear a mask and you see somebody who does, well, they're just reminding you to wash your hands. That's pretty tame, isn't it? And so there is no polarization, no kind of internal culture war around mask use. And later we deployed the same pre-bumping tactic around vaccine use as well, which is why Taiwan does not have an anti-vax political faction, but rather a very fierce battle between the supporter of different brands of vaccines. There's people who insist that only BNT Pfizer, which is procured by civic-hacker-turned-Digital and TSMC, they trust those brands, and they insist that Medigen, the homebrew, is toxic or something.
Right.
And there's people who hold the reverse thoughts. But it's okay. I got all four brands just to make a case. But anyway, the point here is that there is a pre-bunking of these dynamics, very tense, very
Mm.
contested, into constructive uses. So it's almost like pressure shaping a diamond, and Taiwan is diamond shaped, so that the conflicts, the diversity out of a very pro-free speech society, where the most free, according to Freedom House on the freedom on the internet,
Oh.
when it comes to freedom of expressions, and turning that into an engine of co-creation, not an engine of distrust.
And zooming back out, Audrey, you've been able to sort of work a lot with other governments around the world. And of course, we're seeing, some of, for example, what Anne Applebaum has written about Autocracy Inc. and this sort of network effect of other autocracies around the world. How have you been able to sort of help them, or sort of have you been able to consult with them? And what are your views about how the rest of the world's other democracies might be struggling with this? And what would your advice to them be?
Yeah, definitely. So again, to pre-bunk when it comes to authoritarianism, is to look at their main meta-narrative, which
Mm.
is always democracy never deliver. Democracy only leads to chaos. Only autocratic regimes can respond to societal challenges such as the pandemic, the infodemic, AI, you name it. Right, so that's always the meta narrative, and every year you see a different variation of that virus, mimetic virus, but the root RNA is always the same. And so to pre-bunk that is to say, actually, democracy does deliver, but how can you say that if you only have a very limited form of democracy, of a very long latency every 4 years, and very limited bandwidth, just choosing one candidate out of two or four, and that's what 1 or 2 bits of information every 4 years. You can't pre-bunk that if people's idea of democracy is just this very restricted bandwidth communication.
Yeah.
And so to fix that, you have to get people the exposure of what we call continuous democracy, meaning that we really need to build ideas that let people, whenever they have an idea, share this with people and so on. So in Taiwan, we institutionalized this kind of conversation using a platform called Polis. And it showed people what are the uncommon grounds despite their initial ideological differences. And we've been exporting, if you will, this idea of a pro-social media. So not something that drives people apart, but
Mm.
something that brings people closer. And it's been deployed everywhere around the world. So the Polis technology that I just mentioned was just successfully
Thank you for
deployed
sharing.
in Kentucky, in Bowling Green,
Oh,
through what could be
wow.
GB. Right. So if you click in that link, I think it's beautifully designed. You saw that over the course of the previous months, almost 8,000 people in Bowling Green chimed in more than 1 million times on the future of Warren County. And you can look at this beautiful infographics that is AI generated but fully
Right.
grounded around community identity, public service, housing, economic development, so on and so forth. And the great thing about the current generation of AI is that once the mayor or any of those committed listeners responded on any of those summaries, you can use what's called influence functions to go back to the actual like 40 people who contributed these and these words that got into the summary, that got the decisive action going, and write very personalized email back to them saying, thanking to this particular part of your sentiment, which you resonate with, or other people did not resonate with. We took this action and thanking you for it. And if you have additional thing to say, here's how you say it. So there's a continuous feedback loop
Yeah.
going that makes this kind of scalable, broad listening really possible at low cost and low risk as well. And we've also been able to deploy it on a larger scale. For example, there is this website called Engaged California, which is,
Yes. Yes, with
yeah,
Gavin Newsom is involved in that. I think we were, yeah, being recently
yes,
talking about this and reading about this.
that's right. So we finally have a larger than Taiwan polity. To refer to, California is almost double the size of Taiwan.
Mm.
And so on the fire recovery of Eaton and Palisade and so on, people can now chime in with this uncommon ground engine. So yes, we've been exporting
I
this
love
idea
that.
of participatory democracy.
Audrey, it's almost as if you were designing or redesigning the idea of democracy for the 21st century, right? Because I think the idea of democracy as we know it was designed for a very different era. And so now, as we look forward, and I want to make sure we have enough time for folks to ask questions, so have your questions ready in the audience. But as we're thinking about AI and sort of the opportunities and risks that come with AI, we've spoken at length about this, but how do you think AI is going to be a game changer to enhance democracy? Maybe you can talk us through some of the ideas that we've been thinking about, and you've been thinking about on this.
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, AI isn't necessarily pro-democracy. We have also seen authoritarian
Of
intelligence,
course.
which is also AI, that makes the citizens transparent to the state, right?
Yeah.
So when I talk about radical transparency, it's about making the state transparent to the citizens, but it's also been deployed by authoritarian regimes the other way. So there's a fundamental clash of values. If we're not careful, AI could accelerate threats to democracy, not
Yeah.
just hack elections or hyperpolarized information bubbles, but normalizing a surveillance society and so-called social credits, which is really authoritarian intelligence that is applied in a really fundamentally Orwellian fashion. On
Hmm.
the other hand, the other direction that I call assistive intelligence is a tool to augment human cooperation and decision making. So one very quick example. Last March, we decided that we should not censor speech, of course, but there's some commercial speech, advertisements on social media platform that's
In Taiwan's
becoming
election
very dangerous.
last year, you were saying,
Yeah,
right?
yes, that's very dangerous. Not just leading up to our January election last year, we saw deepfake videos and audios especially, but actually even after the election, you see some advertisement on, say, Facebook, featuring, say, Jensen Huang, the
Yes, I
NVIDIA
remember
bonus
that.
guy.
Very convincing deep
Yes.
fake.
Yeah, exactly. If you click it, Jensen wants to sell you some stock or some books or some
Crypto.
crypto. Yeah, and which is actually did sound like Jensen. And so of course it's all deepfake. And so we asked people in Taiwan what to do together. And that's what we always do. We sent 200,000 random numbers in Taiwan through an SMS text message coming from 111, the government number, simply asking, how do you feel about information integrity online? So we did broad listening, and we also asked, would any of you have some time, a long half day online in citizen assemblies to talk through the measures that people have about this? And so thousands of people signed up. We chose through random stratified sampling a statistical representation of the Taiwanese society, 450 people in 45 rooms of 10 people each in those breakout rooms. So in plenary, people heard about the ideas the measures that's proposed by fellow
Mm.
citizens, and in rooms of 10 people, and this is crucial, almost like a jury, people went through those possibilities. Because if you individually poll people, the most extreme idea tend to gain currency. But in rooms of 10, actually the most resonating, the most nuanced idea gain currency. So in small conversation networks facilitated by an assistive AI, so that the quiet people are encouraged to speak up, the loud people who interrupt others don't get more than 5 seconds, and so on and so forth. We did get a very coherent set of demands. So like one room maybe saying, we would like to flip the default. The default should not be that it's legitimate until it's flagged as scam. It should be its default as scam until Jensen Huang signs it using digital signature or KYC mechanisms. Another room may say, if somebody gets scammed out of, say, $7 million because of those unsigned advertisement, Facebook should be liable for the full $7 million instead of just fining them. And another room may say, TikTok, ByteDance, they don't have a legal representative in Taiwan, so we can't really assign full liability. And if they don't comply, we should slowly slow down the connection to their servers so that all their business gradually goes to Google or something. And so it's very coherent, very nuanced, and it does
Yes.
not touch anything on content level censorship. And so it was then passed as law last, I think, June and July. So just a few months after the consultation. And then today, this year, if you open up Facebook or YouTube, you don't see those scam advertisements anymore. So it proved that in small conversation networks, assistive intelligence can augment collective intelligence of the people and then come up with something that is really working very nuanced and does not let us backslide in our
Right.
commitment to freedom of expression.
I just know that the people, my former colleagues at Google in that region would have been pulling out their hairs at the sort of, slowing down of the regulation. But I know it was very effective. So well done, Audrey. So I want to turn over to questions now to make sure we can get everything covered. The first one we have is actually from one of our audience members, Michelle Price, who I know personally and works in the cyberspace and with a background in sort of geopolitics as well. And she's asked, Audrey, at a societal level, do you think democracies or autocracies are better at AI? So both in creating it, working with it, deploying it, quote unquote, regulating it, etc.
Well, it's like asking, starting, say, 2014, you started a race with authoritarian regimes and democracy, but then you're racing actually on opposing tracks.
Yes.
And it's a weird race because the more you run to autocracy, the further you are from the democracy, and vice versa. And so in this kind of race, I don't think there's a winner. The winner depends on the goal, right? So if the democracy runners turn around and runs into autocracies, then the autocracies won, and vice versa. And I think that really is the main difference. There's a constant fight within liberal democracies to uphold the fundamental values that we have that comes from an in-person era of
Mhm.
like privacy as contextual integrity and freedom of assembly, of expression, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, in an AI-mediated world, none of this is protected by physical laws by default. So the default could very well be that every single intermediate agent can wiretap each and every interaction of you with the world. It's like instead of wearing an eyeglass, you
Mhm.
wear a VR of sorts that takes in all the photon, upload it to the cloud, and push some propaganda and then back into your retina. That could be the default. There is nothing in the cyberspace that says that the physical augmentation or assistance is easier than the physical authoritarian takeover. And so all this is to say that this fight of defaults or norms, as we call it, is really the pivotal struggle of today's day and age. And I do think I'm cautiously optimistic that democracies will be able to counter the meta narrative that only autocracies can regulate this kind of deepfake and things like that. It's just like in early pandemic, there's this overarching meme that says, oh, only Wuhan, and the whole of society authoritarian regimes can actually clamp down on virus through lockdowns and takedowns and shutdowns.
Right.
However, we proved in Taiwan and New Zealand and some many other places that actually all of society responses work better if it's a democracy because people came up with those measures themselves and you don't suffer from the fatigue. And it proved to be true in 2022, at least. Nobody says the authoritarian thing anymore is the best way to counter the pandemic. And so so I think we're seeing more or less the same when it comes to AI regulation. It does make sense for people to shift from this mainframe thinking where all the AI frontier labs control all the models into this personal computing kind of thinking, where we do have control of smaller, narrower, perhaps, but much more explainable models that people can
Mm.
steer and tune themselves without giving up on privacy, contextual integrity, and so on.
Fantastic. These following two questions, I guess, like tie into each other because one is talking about sort of the hardware side of things, and the second one is talking about the export of ideas and sort of the software side of things, if you will. The first one is your views on the US-China semiconductor export bans and what it might do to Taiwan, right? Sort of the compute power behind all of the technologies that we're talking about. Is there a risk that making China less dependent on Taiwan for chips means that Taiwan is more at risk? And then I think separate to that, the second part of this question is, you've talked about what you think works about Taiwan's approach as a sort of peer-to-peer government, and in helping other governments with that. But what are some of the biggest challenges in exporting those sort of models and learnings to places like the UK and Europe, and of course the US we can put in a separate bucket as well. But those two sort of broad ideas.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the Sunflower Movement's deliberation topics was precisely around trustworthy digital infrastructure. So instead of saying that Huawei and ZTE were just market players in our then new 4G infrastructure, we concluded, and it's not just the government, but people on the street really concluded that it's a big systemic risk if we have at every software and firmware update to reassess whether they have been de facto taken over by the party or by the PLA. And so we switched to what's later called a clean network or a trusted tech stack to secure our 4G and now 5G networks.
Mm.
And so I think there's a term now called digital solidarity that captures how democracy can band together to support each other's digital development. And like AI diffusion rules, the chip export ban, and so on. I don't think these are individual tactics. I think these are just a implementations of this wide range idea that the American and Taiwanese and other trusted countries, the expert tackling challenges, including cyber attacks, in a collaborative way and sharing best practice from respective experiences. And so I wholeheartedly support this kind of digital solidarity. And whether that it will reduce dependence on Taiwanese chips and so on, I think that is just the downstream issues that we have to work with. But the upstream requirements of digital democracies supporting each other in solidarity, I think that takes precedence. And so I think the US-Taiwan relationship today is grounded in this kind of mutual benefit and mutual respect. So that's the first question. And the second question, I think the main challenge really is that you need two things to deploy this kind of broad listening new democratic forms. You need urgency that's shared among the population,
Mm.
and you need air cover. That is to say, you need the mayor, the governor, and so on to say, I don't know what the people will produce in terms of ideas, but I pre-commit myself into implementing or at least substantially responding to whatever idea they came up with, because otherwise it's just open washing. Right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the urgency part, you can't really manufacture urgency. So, like in California, we were slated to launch the platform on what we thought is the most urgent pressure, which is the social media use by teenagers, by children. And we actually thought that is a case of something about them without them, because certainly they did not vote in the legislators that tries to, ban the use of social media. So we want to have a consultation with first the children and then their parents and so on. But on the day of launch, the wildfire happened. So we did not get to launch initially. And then we switched very quickly into wildfire prevention and mitigation. And in a sense, that's even more urgent than the social media harm, which feels chronic compared to
Yes.
the wildfire harms. But then I think it is also better in the sense of wildfire. There's no like pro wildfire party, and this urgency made like control burns. The NIMBY maybe in my backyard, and so on. Like first. in a way that is nonpartisan, that is cross-partisan, something that is high on the agenda of each and every Californian. And so you need kind of the infrastructure in place, the
Mm.
air cover already in place, and then to look at the one urgency that unites people across political divides and launch with that. So I wouldn't call it a kind of blocker, but it is a real challenge to respond very quickly to urgencies and launch in response to that.
Yes, I fear that that's quite difficult to do in sort of broader societies where maybe there's fragmentation as well. And this ties into our next question, actually, with from Evan Colden. He says that as an American expat living and working in New Zealand, lucky duck, for the past 5 years, I would love to hear Audrey spend 30 seconds to 1 minute talking about the best case scenario for the next 5 years versus worst case scenario on the direction of the US and China slash globally.
Yeah, definitely. So the best case scenario, as I mentioned, is that we collectively pre-bunk against the authoritarian message that only autocracies can fight against emerging all of society risks. And we will be able to prove that grassroots organization and on the meso level, like the Bowling Green level, participatory democracies, and on a federal and international level, this digital solidarity and shared civic infrastructure is actually much more resilient against the threats posed by generative AI and agentic AI to the whole of society. So that's the best case scenario. We'll be able to steer, and that's my job actually, cyber ambassador. Cyber means cybernetics, which is a old
Right.
Greek word that means steering, right? So we will be able to not just fight incessantly between the people who push on the brakes, saying that we need to pause AI, and the
Right.
people who push on the gas pedal, saying we need to accelerate AI. We'll be able to differentially accelerate, to have a steering wheel that steers away from authoritarian intelligence into assistive intelligence that's democratic, decentralized, and defensive. And so that is the best case scenario. Vitaly Buterin wrote about this at length using a meme called D/AC, that stands for this kind of differential acceleration. So that's best case scenario. The worst case scenario, well, you can just
Take
look
a deep
at
breath first.
yes, you can just look at nationalsecurity.ai, which is a
Okay.
very interesting website built by some of my collaborators and co-signed by Dan Hendricks, Eric Schmitz, and Alexander Wang, that warns against a scenario of various regimes in hidden bunkers that can survive a first strike, build super intelligence, super weapons, that's like a nuclear bomb that goes off randomly, and one of this
Right.
goes off randomly. So that's like literally the worst case scenario. And if you want to like look at the nitty-gritty details of why mutually assured AI malfunction is kind of the saving hope against that scenario, please check out nationalsecurity.ai.
Yeah, maybe not for the folks in the US who are getting ready for bedtime, gives you nightmares. Maybe the ones in APAC time zone can take a look. But definitely take a good look through that. It's very interesting. And I think this also ties into our next question from James Mulcher, who's asked, against all of this tech stuff that's happening, for a lot of folks who are not tech savvy or less tech savvy, how do you get these citizens to buy in, right? For folks in the US context, for example, who are already disengaged with democracy, how do you get them to lean back in and additionally sort of engage on the tech scale?
Well, we've always emphasized that we're helping the helpers. So we're
Mm,
not saying that everybody should go online for facilitated conversations, although we are working on open source applications that enable the kind of breakout rooms, the AI facilitated conversation. I've been working with Harvard Berkman Klein Center on,
yes, I can
frankly,
never say that word either.
right. So yes. So on frankly.org, which is an
Yes.
open source implementation of the online deliberation platform. But the same technology can also empower
Mhm.
the facilitators of small scale in-person grassroots groups. And that's the most important. So if we think of facilitators not getting replaced by AI, but rather people learn to self-facilitate, and only one of them at a 10-person table need to bring out their phone and run some AI-assisted software that keeps the time, keeps the flow, and also through meronymic sharing of the resonating points, that is to say, not really identifiable back to individuals, but share what's resonating with other pods that are having a conversation network. We can then imagine much better grassroots organization powers of those facilitators that's on the ground. And so for people who are not tech savvy, for them it's the same experience of getting into the small scale conversations or town halls or things like that, but just automatically their facilitators will be able to close the loop much quicker. With much more input from their peers and even across different ideological camps, people will be able to hear what's called surprising validators, people that they felt very different from them would nevertheless agree on those uncommon grounds that's brought in by their facilitators. And so that is the idea. It is through conversation networks to empower, to help the helpers.
That's fantastic. Helping the helpers. Audrey, my other managing editor, Jeremy Dicker, who is also on this call, and I are going to be speaking in Sydney at the Sunrise Festival later on this month. Have you been to Australia? Because, we're having a federal election there, and I'm sure there'd be a lot of people who'd be very engaged and keen to learn from you as well. But just putting
Yeah,
that
yeah.
there, we can maybe
Mhm.
catch up about this offline as well. But I do want to have one more question from the audience, which is what you think. I'm going to edit this slightly. What is the most urgent gap in policy that could cause AI development to outpace democratic safeguards? And then finally, I want to end on your advice to folks, a lot of us who are in this field who want to work in the intersection of technology and geopolitics. What would your advice be?
Yeah, definitely. And so one of the main danger, and that is what we have seen a decade ago, is that we could get trapped into what's called product market traps when it comes to
Oh,
AI. So we talked about a decade ago, like we get this parasitic AI that predicts what would engage through enragement,
yes.
what will keep us glued to the touchscreens and so on. And in fact, 2 years ago, there was a study that says a average undergrad using TikTok in the US, if you want to convince them of TikTok individually, you have to pay them almost $60 a month. They lose that much utility through FOMO. On the other hand, if
Wow.
there is a magic button that they can press to move everybody else around them off TikTok along with them, they're willing to pay you almost $30 a month. And so it's a situation where everybody loses, but because of lack of portability, lack of choice, people cannot migrate to newer alternative like Blue Sky or other, free software implementations of social media, such as True Social, without sacrificing a lot of their network values. And so, imagine actually if you switch telephone numbers. Every time you have to switch to a different telecom provider with better quality. That would be very inconvenient, which is why we have number portability. If you switch to a different bank, if the ATM machine stopped letting you withdraw cash interbank, that would be very inconvenient. Actually, new banks would not be able to set up.
Right.
Again, which is why we have regulations about interbank protocols and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we don't have this equivalent when it comes to social media and other parasitic AI networks. So that is one glaring gap. And this is now being worked on. You can see, and full
Oh, thank you
disclosure,
so much for
I work
sharing.
with the Project Liberty Institute as a
Yep.
senior fellow. And at PLI, we advocate for this kind of Digital Choice Act. And in the US, for the first time, it's now being signed into law by Governor Cox in Utah. So starting next year, if you're a citizen in Utah and you want to switch from TikTok or any social media to open alternatives, by law, you're able then to keep all your connections and all your posts, your content as well. And so this is part of, I think, a paradigm shift so that instead of getting trapped into suboptimal AI that's extractive, we're now promoting this free competition so that people can compete to the top, not to the bottom of the brainstem as well.
That's incredible. And then finally, Audrey, just your piece of
Mhm.
advice or career advice for folks who are inspired by what you do and would want to sort of contribute to this space in their future work.
Yeah, definitely. So to the all the young people drawn to the intersection of tech and geopolitics, we need you. We
Yes.
need young people to answer to the challenge of our own era. I remember when I was 33, when I was tapped as
When you
reverse
had retired
mentor
from
to the
entrepreneurship, as
cabinet.
you said.
That's right. That's right. And then I joined this what's some people called public entrepreneurship, right, in the public sector.
Yes.
And I'm astonished at how readily senior career public service officials sought input from our young generation, including yours truly, in their 20s and 30s on things like AI. So don't underestimate what you can contribute. You can be the steers person. You can be the cybernetic person that contributes even early in your career, actually, especially because you're early in your career
Yes.
and your fluency with this kind of fresh outlook on global issues are incredibly valuable. And so when I became the cabinet minister when I was 35, I'm no longer young, so I needed my own reverse mentors. I've been constantly steered by people younger than 35 throughout my 8 years of public service.
I love that. Thank you so much for all your insights, Audrey. I'd love to be able to get everyone to thank you, and I'm mute, but they can't. So I would just thank you on behalf of Intrigue Media and everyone who's on this call. We will be sure to share the show notes with you and all the fantastic links that Audrey has very kindly shared. And Audrey, thank you again for all that you do, and I hope we will answer this call to action that you have placed on us, and hope to see you and chat to you soon, maybe in Australia or in
Yeah,
DC,
definitely.
wherever.
Or in DC, I'm coming to the AI Plus Expo.
Oh,
And so
fantastic. I will see you in
definitely in
June.
DC then.
Awesome.
Yes, see
Great.
you in
Well, thank
June.
you
And
everyone
until
for
then, live
joining.
long and
Thank
prosper.
you. Bye.